Good Yontif. We are approaching the 7th and 8th day of Pesach. And of course, Pesach is a time of Geula, of redemption, where the Jews are freed from slavery and start their trek through the desert to become a nation. And on the 8th day of Pesach, we have a Haftorah which focuses on the ultimate redemption in the time of Mashiach. And the question that we always have to ask ourselves is the following. Are we approaching and going in the right direction towards Mashiach, or are we sliding and times are getting worse? That doesn't mean Mashiach won't come even if times are getting worse. There are those that understand that Mashiach will come when times are very bad, and God comes in the last minute to save us. The other approach to Mashiach is that no, there's a slower trajectory towards the ultimate time of peace and tranquility and knowledge of God. And that's actually in this in the Haftorah that we're going to read on the 8th day of Pesach, which is from Yeshayahu, from Isaiah. And it says that in the time of Mashiach, Mala Aretz Deya as Hashem Kamayim Machasim Liyam, that the world will be full of knowledge of God, like the water that covers the sea. So you could read this very narrowly and say it's a question of religious knowledge and acceptance of God, and that might be the way a simple reading would lead you. But the way Maimonides approaches it is when he talks about knowledge, and even knowledge of God is not just saying, I accept God, I believe in monotheism, I accept the Torah. Knowledge of God is knowledge of everything that God has created in the world. When Maimonides starts off his book of Yesodei HaTorah, his foundations of the Torah, he starts talking about the mitzvah of loving God, the commandment to love God. He says the mitzvah to love God is to know God, to understand God, and the way to do that is to understand and to learn about the wonders that God has made in this world. It's to study God's creation. Very interestingly, when he says that, he doesn't even mention studying Torah. When he lists it as one of his 613 commandments in his book of commandments, he does say that you should also get to knowledge of God through studying Torah. But in his actual code of Jewish law, he doesn't mention the study of Torah. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't study Torah, that you can't come to a knowledge of God through studying Torah, but he's really saying that Torah is just a reflection of God's creation. And therefore studying God's creation, which is really studying philosophy and science, will give you a greater appreciation of God, and it will also give you a greater appreciation of how God acts in this world and what his character traits are, what his midos are. And those midos, those character traits are ones which we are supposed to emulate, which he says not so much further along in his Code of Jewish Laws, where he says there's a mitzvah of halachta b'drachav. We should go in his ways, meaning God's ways, and say, just as God has certain great character traits, good character traits, so too should we emulate those traits and be kind and generous and holy like God is. Interestingly, Maimonides, the last book and the last law that he has in his Code of Jewish Laws is in the Law of Kings. And in that section, he actually quotes this verse that's in the Haftorah, that eventually there will be knowledge of God spreading throughout the world. And as it says in the verses just previous to this one in Isaiah, that's what it says, Gar Zev and Mekevis, that the wolf will lie down with the sheep. And it's promoting this idea of eventual peace in the world. Some take that literally, others take that more as symbolically, as a metaphor for there will be peace in the world, that nations will no longer fight nations. Lo yisu goy al goy charev. Nations will not pick up a sword against other nations. And my understanding of Maimonides, which I think is his intent, is that the more knowledge we have of God, or you could put it, the more knowledge we have of God's creation, the more knowledge we have of his character traits, the more we understand what is right and what is wrong in this world. And as that knowledge spreads through the world's population, by definition, the world will become a better place. What this tells us is that the coming of Mashiach, as I mentioned other times, is more of a slow process. That spreading of knowledge could take place, I suppose it could take place in a short time, but it would seem that more logically it would take place over a long period of time, which is exactly what we've seen. Maimonides actually says that even the rise of Christianity and Islam, which he says is a distortion of Judaism, a distortion of the Torah, he says in another section, which had been censored and not that accessible for many years, but he says quite clearly that's a good thing. Because what happened was Christianity and Islam spread the words of the Torah and the knowledge of the Torah. Maybe there's some distortions, but it spread the ideas that are in the Torah. And now everyone's speaking about it. And therefore, I believe what he means is that we now have all of the good ideas that are in the Torah, the attributes that the Torah is trying to promote, and through that, the world will become a better place. And as I've said before, it's not just the attributes, it's also science. And again, in Maimonides, the idea of science and philosophy are intermingled. They're not two separate subjects, they're not two separate categories. And I think we could still say that that's true. The more you know about science, the more you know about the world, the more you know about how things work, the more you should be moved to be a better person. Maybe it's not so simple to make that correlation, but I think that correlation exists. And therefore, the more knowledge that we have in the world, the more peaceful the world will become. Now, you might be listening to this and say, what are you talking about? The world is actually a much more dangerous place. All we have to do is today look at the newspaper, and you see in Israel there's terrorism, in Ukraine there's a terrible war, there's a war in Syria, and there's war in many parts of the world where many people are suffering. And that's very true. But actually, if you read proper studies, you'll see that we actually live in a more peaceful time than there ever was in history. Less people are dying in war, and less people are dying a violent death than there ever was in history. And that's even, according to a study I just looked at, even taking into account World War I and World War II. It's with the advent of states and the fact that they were no longer just tribal, and the wars are sort of constant, and also with the advent of technology, war doesn't kill, interestingly enough, as many people as it did before. And again, you might be saying, well, what happens in nuclear war? I don't know. I'm not a prophet, and nobody knows what the future of the world will be. And you could debate this and say, with the rise of nuclear arms, the world is headed towards an apocalypse. But as we see it until now, the rise of technology has actually caused less death. And the truth is, the hope is, I should say, that the fact that we all have nuclear weapons now, rational players will not unleash their nuclear warheads because of fear of immediate and devastating reprisals. So really, we are moving to more peaceful. The problem is that we have more knowledge of everything that's happening in the world. And of course, the news doesn't have a news story about peace in Denmark. They have the story of the war in Ukraine. The other problem we have is that we have a spread of knowledge, right? Knowledge, like water covers the sea, we have knowledge. The level of education and literacy is far surpassing anything that existed previously. Of course, there's pockets of populations that don't have literacy and don't have so much knowledge, but knowledge is out there for everyone. And the hope was, with the rise of the internet, that knowledge would be even more widespread, and everybody would know a lot about whether it's science, philosophy, everything that's out there is just more accessible. Of course, the problem is, again, anyone who's listening would say, well, the problem is that that's not what's happening. That with the rise of the internet, we have what you call fake news, false ideas, and people believing all kinds of things. And therefore, there is a reason to be slightly pessimistic, or maybe even more than slightly pessimistic, about the future of knowledge and what people accept as truth. And there's a rise of autocracy today whether it's the United States, in Russia, in China. But again, you always have to make sure that you're not just looking at a small at a small piece of history. If you would judge everything from what happened between 1939 and 1945, you would have no reason to be optimistic at all, and I would have been very pessimistic living through that time. But when you sort of draw back and you look at the larger picture, times are getting better. Russia, with even its rise of autocracy, still has probably more freedom and more economic health than they ever did. In China, people are living better than they did before, right? There's a direction here which we're not happy. And again, we don't know exactly where it's going to lead, but people are better off than they were before. And better off not only economically, but also education. They do have more access to knowledge. The more access to knowledge, the hope is, and I believe this is what Maimonides believes, and I think this is true, that eventually truth has a way of rising to the surface. If knowledge is out there, at the end of the day, yes, there's a lot of people pushing a lot of false ideas, and there's a lot of ignorant people who are willing to accept all kinds of nonsense, but truth is more lasting. Emes, truth, is more lasting than sheker, than falsehood. And therefore, the optimistic view of the world is that eventually that will be successful. That truth will be victorious over falsehood, and therefore peace will reign. And the rise of modern states and modern technology and modern science will help get the world to a better place than it was ever before. And you could even just look at another just small idea as even the Jewish population, of course the Holocaust decreased the Jewish population by a third, and that's probably one of the worst times that Jews have had in history. But just looking at some statistics, in the 18th century, it seems that there might not have been more than 1 million Jews in the world. And then there was a dramatic rise, and then the Holocaust, of course, it was decreased. But actually, again, looking history from the long view, Jewish population is actually doing better than it ever was. We know, besides losing Jews in the Holocaust, we also lose them through assimilation. But the optimistic view is that there's still a rise. There's still a healthy Jewish foundation. More Jews now live in Israel, or about half of the Jews in the world live in Israel. And again, it's under threat from a nuclear power that might come about in Iran. But we're protected. At least as far as we know, we're protected and we're safe. The other half of the Jews live mostly in the United States and Canada and some of Europe, but the United States has a large portion of it. And Jews are more safe than they ever were before. It seems that the prophecy of Isaiah of that the lamb will lie down with the wolf is somewhat coming true from a Jewish perspective. Again, depends. When you open the paper today, you might not think that, but it's actually much better. So I think we have to read this passage in Isaiah, and we have to think of ourselves as being really at a point in history where we're coming closer and closer to the time of Mashiach. Again, not necessarily the apocalyptic time of Mashiach, but rather the slow growth Mashiach, the point where there will be more knowledge, and that knowledge will help make us to be better people. Again, there's different ways of judging what's considered knowledge, what's considered a better person, but I think we could judge it by saying there's more morality. There's rules of even in war of engagement of who you're allowed to kill and who not to kill. Is it good to have war? Is it good to kill anyone? No. But that's not how war was not so long ago. And hopefully we're moving in that direction. And hopefully we're going to have Yizkor on the 8th day of Pesach. We look at the past generations, and going back not so long ago, people suffered. And if you just look at how we've progressed, the Jewish world population has progressed from the time of Holocaust, from being in countries which were not inviting to us at all, in poverty and persecuted, and now not so much later, 75 years later, the state of Israel is celebrating its 75th birthday. With all the problems that exist in Israel, we're still so much better off than we were before. And hopefully that's the path that we'll be taking in the future. Good job, Tiff.